When the dust settled after World War II, the US and Russia were the biggest and strongest civilizations in the world, referred to as superpowers. The two countries had polarizing opinions on how economies should be run. Russia stood for communism. The US stood and still stands for the idea of capitalism. With America being scared of communism and such power held by the two countries, there was bound to be a conflict. Said conflict was titled the Cold War. The Cuban Missile Crisis was the peak of the Cold War. On May 7th, the Soviet Union and Cuba established diplomatic relations. 20 days later, the U.S. ended their foreign aid program with Cuba.
On October 28, 1959, the United States and Turkey agreed to place 15 nuclear-tipped American Jupiter missiles inside its borders. The missiles were to be put in place in Turkey on June 1, 1961 for defense purposes. The Bay of Pigs invasion was a failed invasion of Cuba taken out by a paramilitary agency called Brigade 2506, which was a group of Cuban exiles in the United States.
On October 14, 1962, a U-2 plane flying over Cuba for a routine flight training practice photographed medium-range SS-4 ballistic missiles being assembled for installation on the island nation of Cuba. President Kennedy was briefed on the situation on the 16th. He went on with his official schedule as to not alarm the American public, meeting in secret with a board of advisors known as the Executive Committee, or ExComm. The country's main concern became how close the missiles were to the American coast, Cuba being just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. The Soviets saw this as evening the playing field after the United States put their own missiles pointed at Russia and Turkey and the Bay of Pigs invasion of 1961.
After hearing that there were missiles in Cuba, the U.S. determined that this was unacceptable and began moving military assets to bases in southern United States.
On October 18th, President Kennedy was visited by Soviet Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko, who stated the missiles in Cuba were purely defensive and did not pose an imminent threat to the United States. Without revealing what he knew of the existence of the missiles, Kennedy read to Gromyko the public warning of September 4th, stating the gravest consequences would come if Soviet offensive weapons were placed in Cuba.
On October 21st, Kennedy is notified that if an airstrike plan was to be carried out, it would not ensure 100% destruction of the missiles in Cuba.
The State Department also transmitted a message to most U.S. diplomatic posts abroad instructing representatives and messengers to brief foreign heads of government or foreign ministers about the Cuban Missile Crisis. After hearing of the situation, France's leader told an envoy to tell Kennedy that he has France's support. British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan told U.S. Ambassador David Bruce that he will support the United States in any way possible. Kennedy briefed the cabinet and congressional leaders on the situation. President Kennedy wrote to Nikita Khrushchev, Premier of the Soviet Union, "I have not assumed that you or any other sane man would in this nuclear age deliberately plunge the world into a world war, which is crystal clear no country would win and which could only result in catastrophic consequences to the whole world, including the aggressor." At 7 o'clock that night, President Kennedy gave a speech to the American public on television about the conflict with the Soviet Union and Cuba. He explained the evidence of the missiles and his call for their removal and about the naval quarantine that was being set up.
The people in America and other countries nervously awaited Russia's response. Americans who thought their country was about to become a war zone stockpiled food, gas, and other necessities. Schools had students practice war drills, people built bomb shelters, and readied their cellars and basements in case of the worst. Many people saw this as an instigator, but there were still others who wanted full-out nuclear war with Russia. The American Strategic Air Command went on DEFCON 2 on October 24th, the highest level of alert short of war.
On October 23rd, Kennedy officially signed Proclamation 3504, authorizing the naval quarantine, which was carried out. While the quarantine was being put into place, the knowledge of Soviet submarines posed a very big risk and threw the whole operation off. The Cuban armed forces were on the highest alert after Fidel Castro announced a combattal arm. In a 90-minute televised speech, Fidel Castro announced to the Cuban public that Cuba will never disarm while the United States keeps up with their current hostility. Castro goes as far as to deny the existence of missiles in Cuba.
At 10 in the morning, at an ExComm meeting, Kennedy was notified that 2 Soviet ships were moving towards the blockade and were within miles of the blockade line. Later in the meeting, John McCone announces, "We have a preliminary report which seems to indicate that some of the Russian ships have stopped dead in the water." Dean Russick supposedly says to Mick George Bundy, "We're eyeball to eyeball, and I think the other fellow just blinked." the Defense Department drafts 2 plans to increase civil defense preparations during a possible military engagement with Cuba. The first outlines civil defense measures which could be taken in the vicinity of targets close to Cuba under attack with conventional weapons. The second suggests measures which should be taken in response to possible nuclear attack with MRBM range.
The missiles in Cuba were not operational. Aware that Cuba and the Soviet Union were still not backing down, Kennedy personally wrote a letter to Premier Khrushchev. The president wrote, "I urge restraint upon those in this country who were urging action in this matter at that time. And then I learned beyond doubt what you have not denied, namely that all these public assurances were false and that your military people had set out recently to establish a set of missile bases in Cuba. I ask you to recognize clearly, Mr. Chairman, that it was not I who issued the first challenge in this case, and that in the light of this record, these activities in Cuba required the responses I have announced."
Khrushchev orders for American missiles in Turkey to be removed, and he also demands that U.S. forces do not invade the island of Cuba. To this, Kennedy says that all activity in Cuba has to stop before any negotiations are made at all.
The CIA intelligence memorandum containing information compiled as of 6 a.m. reported that 3 of the 4 medium-range ballistic missile sites in San Cristobal and 2 sites at Sagua La Grande appeared to be fully operational. At this time, the mobilization of Cuban forces was reported to be continuing at a high rate, but the CIA advised that the Cuban forces are still under orders not to engage unless attacked. At 9, Premier Khrushchev started to broadcast a message calling for the dismantling of the U.S. missiles in Turkey and said that in return the Soviet Union would remove their missiles in Cuba. After the DEFCON meeting breaks up, a smaller group composed of President Kennedy, McNamara, Robert Kennedy, Bundy, Rusk, Llewellyn Thompson, and Theodore Sorin meet in the Oval Office. They agree that the second letter to be sent to Khrushchev should be reinforced with an oral message passed through Ambassador Dobrin. They also agree that Dobrin should be informed that if Soviet missiles are not withdrawn, there will be military action against Cuba, but if they are, the U.S. will be willing to give a non-invasive pledge. Dean Rusk suggests one further component to the message, an assurance that while there can be no public or explicit deal over the Turkish missiles, the Jupiters will in fact be removed once the Cuban conflict is resolved. The proposal then gains the approval of the group and the president.
12 minutes after the day began, Ambassador Finletter was instructed to review the conflict with NATO allies. Soviet technicians had created 24 completely operational MRBM sites in Cuba as of 6 a.m. After he received this message, Kennedy called the message an important and constructive compromise for peace. At 9 a.m., Nikita Khrushchev sent out a new message stating, "The Soviet government, in addition to previous issues, instructs on the cessation of further work at building sites for weapons, has issued a new order on dismantling of the weapons, which you have described as offensive, and the creating and return to the Soviet Union."
Near noon, it is announced by Fidel Castro that the United States needed to ensure non-aggression against Cuba by doing the following things. They included an end to the economic blockade against Cuba, an end to all subversive activities carried out from the United States against Cuba, a halt to all attacks on Cuba carried out from the U.S. military bases on the island of Puerto Rico, the cessation of aerial and naval reconnaissance flights in Cuba airspace and waters, and the return of the Guantanamo base to Cuba. These would be called Castro's 5 points. At the end of the day, Khrushchev agreed to dismantle the missile sites and the U.S. stopped the blockade and secretly took their missiles out of Cuba. The U.S. did not broadcast the fact of their Turkish missile removal, so the government would look tough and so the public would feel safer.
The Cuban Missile Crisis was a tense situation that almost started World War III barely 20 years after the second one ended. It was the closest we've ever come to a nuclear war and scared people into making bomb shelters out of their basements and cellars. The Cold War, especially the Cuban Missile Crisis, was a time of government secrecy, tense international interactions, and public worry. After coming so close to the end of the world, the United States and Russia set up a series of treaties to prevent these types of things from happening. For example, the Outer Space Treaty, that was a national agreement not to send weapons into space. We also now have a hotline that allows American and Russian communication almost instantly, so if any problems like this should arise again, then we can talk them out without thinking that either side wants war. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a major conflict that almost ended in a world war. But because of the conflict, new compromises were put into place to prevent us from ever going into DEFCON 2 again.